it seems, viewed himself as relationship with Voltaire as a supporter of enlightenment. How does that self-image find expression in his policies towards minorities and specifically towards the Jewish people during his reign?
Yes, what a good question, and a very important one. Well, in one respect, his enlightenment, and he certainly was enlightened in the sense that he read huge amounts of enlightened literature. Pierre Bayle was probably the greatest influence on him after Voltaire, perhaps even more important than Voltaire. So he's immersed in the literature of the early Enlightenment. And that did have an effect. He turned Prussia into, in terms of religious affiliation within Christianity, important qualification, he turned Prussia into the most tolerant state in Europe, more tolerant even than the Dutch Republic or contemporary England, which were de facto relatively tolerant to religious minorities. And Frederick said, I just do not give a fig about which particular brand of superstitious nonsense a person might subscribe to. They can all come here. And if Turks want to come here, I build them a mosque. And he demonstrated that in an architectural way, which you can still see in Berlin today. He created for Catholics. I mean, remember, this is a Calvinist, or it's a state which is populated mainly by Lutherans ruled by Calvinists. He created for the Catholics a cathedral on land which he gave himself, St. Hedwig's Cathedral, which is behind the Opera House in the center of Berlin. So that was a fairly dramatic gesture. And when the Jesuit order was closed down in 1773, the Jesuits were expelled from the Habsburg monarchy, he welcomed them into Prussia. He said, oh, you can come and teach my Catholics. They're well-educated people. So from that point of view, the Enlightenment clearly had an impact. But I'm afraid it did not extend to the Jews. There weren't a huge number of Jews in Prussia. They'd been expelled as periodically as elsewhere in Europe. They had been expelled in the early 17th century and then allowed back in by Frederick the Great's great-grandfather, Frederick William the Great Elector. There are, oh golly, I forgot the figure, just a few hundred in Berlin. But they were punching above their weight because they proved to be exceptionally enterprising. They were engaged in manufacturing. They were engaged in financial enterprises. Of course, they were not allowed to buy land, so they're not involved in agriculture. And indeed, that's one of the reasons why Frederick William the Great Elector had let them back in the 1670s, because he needed their money. I mean, that's I'm afraid that was generally the case when Jews were tolerated, when their assets were acquired and their skills were acquired. And Frederick made good use of their financial skills, for example, when he was organizing the debasement of the coinage in the 7 Years' War. So far, so good. So he doesn't actually expel the Jews from Prussia, but he did tighten the screws. He made it more difficult for Jews to come to Prussia, and more specifically to Berlin.